You're watching CCN, Clarksville Community Network, produced by Goodwin Productions. Powered by CDE Lightband.
Hi, I'm Susan Bryant. I'm a photographer and a recent retiree from the art department where I taught photography for 37 years. I took a photography class as a postgraduate student, and the first time I was in the darkroom, I felt this overwhelming sign that that was where I should be. That the camera was the tool that was the right thing for me to use to explore the world and to express myself. Wait a minute, maybe that's... I have been an analog photographer since I started photography 40 years ago, shooting with film. And then recently, in the last 10 years, I began to explore the wet plate collodion process, which was invented in 1851 and involves creating a glass negative and creating tintypes on aluminum plates. Using the collodion process requires that a darkroom be near the exposure of the plate. For my work, I have a darkroom in my basement with easy access to my backyard. Most of the time I do this in the middle of July, and it is usually like a steam bath out here. And so this is wonderful. And if I wasn't retired, I wouldn't be here. So I've been able to photograph in my backyard, move into the darkroom to process the plate, and that has dictated in part my subject matter for this body of work. So this is where I photograph portraits and still lifes, because by this time in the morning, the sun is not hitting it direct, and so we have this really nice ambient light, and it's, I just love it. The darkroom is pretty small. I was really lucky, to tell you the truth. When I moved to Clarksville 37 years ago, I found this house and immediately went down a set of stairs hoping there was a basement. And there was a room perfect for a darkroom that had, in 1936, when the house was built, been used to deliver coal. And so I was able to set up a darkroom right away. In the last 25 years, there has been a re-interest in this process, the collodion process, along with other 19th century processes. In part, I think in reaction to digital media, for people who really enjoy hands-on processes. I've always enjoyed that part of photography, getting my hands wet, making an object. I really love being in the darkroom and hearing the water and smelling the chemistry and touching the images, the objects. So when I started this work 10 years ago, I primarily started with still lifes, photographing objects from my home. My husband and I are huge collectors, and so there were plenty of objects from which to choose. I then also photographed portraits of friends and family members. And then most recently, my work has explored the southern landscape. I began concentrating on the southern landscape in about 2015. I started locally, meaning in my neighborhood. This large oak tree was taken right down the street from where I live. It was foggy that morning. I grabbed my camera, as I also tell my students to do. If you wake up in the morning and you see fog, grab your camera and run, because it doesn't last long and it's beautiful light. the strength, the permanence of this oak tree, even though it has lost limbs over the years. It's several hundred years old. I'm also interested in how the landscape can be both comforting and dangerous. I was lucky enough to take a road trip in the summer of 2017, and part of that road trip took me to Cumberland Island. It was just an incredible experience. When I think about photographs, that oftentimes many of the ones that are interesting to other people have a story behind them. And that's true for me, at least. And the viewer may not know the story, but I think the story often makes the image more meaningful. This is taken at dusk, the light setting behind the trees and the lake at Fall Creek Falls. My interest in photographing the landscape is not to capture a detailed document of the landscape as it was for the 19th century photographers who used this process. I'm trying to capture what it felt like, what it looked like, maybe what it smelled like. So this process, which often diffuses the detail, captures more of that emotional connection. I have a tendency to photograph roads and paths a lot. And it's not only because of what they symbolize, both physically and metaphorically. And in my life right now, I am retiring from a job I've held for 37 years, returning to having more time in my studio and my darkroom, and more time to take road trips. And so the road also signifies that, that change in my life, that next chapter that is around the corner. My portraits and still lifes are part of a series that I call Presence and Absence. That in part is why I prefer to have my subjects turn their face away from me, so that it has a sense of an absence of a person. And also the fact that my 4-year-old granddaughter was not able to stand still for very long. So I had her turn her face away from me, and it surprised me in that one of the technical flaws that is evident in this print was the fact that my silver bath needed to be filtered. But in hindsight, that chemical flaw adds a sense of the human touch to the image, which many people seem to respond favorably to. This could be any young girl. It's not necessarily only a photograph of my granddaughter. So those oyster stains in some of the prints, they're like look like bubbles. It's just from not doing this one step, one summer of cleaning the silver out. from the plate holder. Perfect. So I put this in there, the lens is closed, I pull out the guard, make sure the shutter's cocked, and her face isn't in it so I don't have to say smile. And then we go in and develop it. So I'm waiting for this to stop dripping and then I kind of pinch it off. And then it's ready to go into the silver bath. My husband and I were traveling in Italy in 2014. Part of my intention was to photograph hands of sculptures found in museums and churches. But I also was looking for vistas to photograph parts of Italy. While in Florence, I photographed the sunset. But the day before I photographed this, I dropped my tried and true camera that I was used to using. My husband, trying to console me, said, well, Susan, you still have your iPhone. And I was not consolable. So I was using a camera that I purchased on this day, having not had time to get used to it, to where things were located, but I shot the images anyway. The images I shot with that new camera were probably some of the best that I got the whole trip. This is a lesson I try to tell my students. That it's not the camera, it's not the quality of the camera, the expense of the camera that makes an interesting image. It's the light or the eye of the photographer who composes the image. And so, I mean, this image could have been taken with a $30 plastic camera. One of the many things I love about the Collodion process and the way I have been using it in the last 5 years is the integration of digital technology with the 19th century process. Is that glass in a way? And many times I'm going back and forth between the two. In the case of this image that was captured with a digital camera, I then, upon returning to my studio and darkroom, created a digital positive in which I could use in the darkroom to create a tintype, and then I could scan the tintype in order to make a digital print. And in that way, I'm starting with 21st century technology, moving to 19th century technology, and then back again to 21st century digital technology. Okay, so once this is set up, the work in the darkroom starts. So right now, I'm mixing up the fixer. In the 19th century, cyanide was used as a fixer, and some contemporary collodion photographers still use it. Some people choose not to have it in the house, use a regular hypo fix, so that's what this is. So I'm gonna pour the collodion on the plate. I pour the collodion on and I move it around, and then I drip off the excess into here. When it dries, it's like skin, and so it was used during the Civil War to bind wounds. Do this to try to keep it so it doesn't pool down in one corner and doesn't leave lines. And then I have to turn off the overheads to put it into the silver bath. When the process was used in the 1850s, it began as a process for studio photographers to make portraits. The first event in the United States that was documented with this process was the American Civil War. Photographers like Matthew Brady, whose name is probably best known for documenting the Civil War, But his assistants, Timothy O'Sullivan, Gardner, another photographer, they took their darkrooms in tents and in wagons to the battlefields. The emulsion was so slow that the shutter speeds could not capture action, so the images from the Civil War are of the aftermath of the battles. The story has it, though, that Matthew Brady, after visiting one battlefield as a photographer, was known to run from the battle as cannonballs were chasing him, and from that point forward would send his assistants out into the field to document the war. However, when the tintypes were exhibited or used as documentation, the stamp on the image would say, "From the studio of Matthew Brady." So the photographers were not getting credit for, risking their lives. So they very soon broke away from Matthew Brady and began photographing on their own. And it was those same photographers who, after the Civil War, were hired by government expedition teams who were going over the Rocky Mountains to document the American Western territories. So the history of the medium is really interesting to me. It would stay in the fix for about 5 minutes. Ideally, it would be continually agitating, but unless I have an assistant that I'm paying for the day to do that, I sort of try to keep it in the darkroom, and while I'm getting the next plate ready, like every 30 seconds I walk over and do this. And then after 5 minutes in here, it needs wash for about 15 minutes, and I wash it in a tray in the kitchen sink. Anyway, but we got an image. Well, right now I'm getting the pour bottle for the varnish ready. It protects the plate from being scratched. It also protects the plate from oxidizing. And then this is a flame that I have to use to heat up the plate. So the plate has to be warm and the varnish has to be warm. Kind of like you wish you had 3 hands. So after I would do this, you're supposed to do it until it's not tacky any longer. And it can become really kind of zen-like, kind of meditative. Usually I have music. I heat the plate until I can feel it hot on the back of my skin, but not so hot that it hurts. So I don't want to get this too close to the flame, but I need the flame going. When the plate is finished washing, I bring it down here, pour a little bit of distilled water over it. In addition to my solo exhibit, I decided recently to curate a display of former student work from the past 37 years. So students who took darkroom classes with me from 1982 until 2019. Contacted as many as I could through email, through Facebook, through other social media, and I have been getting, I think I have over 400 photographs from over 100 former and current students, and those images are displayed in the hallway on the main floor of the Art and Design building. The exhibit of the student work is called Reciprocity, and I chose that title because when I think about my career as an educator, I am certain that I gained as much from my students as they gained from me. In little ways, I wanted to recognize them and recognize that fact that had I not had the career I had, I may not still be making this work. Well, I come from a family of educators. My mother was an elementary school teacher. I just always thought that teaching was an important career. After I earned my BFA, I taught 9th grade art for 1 year. And I'm glad I did it because I realized immediately that I was not intended to teach 14-year-olds. I decided to return to school to pursue my MFA so that I could teach adults. Students, for the most part, were very, very curious about this thing called film, growing up in the digital age. Teaching something I love seemed like didn't seem like a job. It seemed like something I got to do, not something I had to do. I got to share with my students, photographers whose work I love. One of the things I loved about teaching was being able to say to them, look at that, look at that, look at that light, or look at that gesture, or look at that object. And I just can't imagine a more fulfilling career. So this is often what I'm doing in here, scanning new plates and printing. So here's a print that just came off. Not bad. This is the instruction manual that my friends Mark Osterman and France Scully Osterman wrote, and it's a basic manual for all of the chemicals and the directions for the Collodion process. When I'm mixing new chemicals, this is my cookbook, this is my recipe book, and you can see the silver nitrate drops. I make notes, like if I'm going to cut a recipe in half. The wet plate process was the most popular and widely used process in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s. In the early 1880s, the dry plate process was invented, which meant that photographers did not have to take their darkroom along with them and freed them up. And then film was invented in 1888 by George Eastman. I have been fortunate enough to visit the George Eastman House Museum in Rochester, New York. It's one of my favorite museums in the world. I was able to go there 3 times because that is where my teachers, my mentors, live. Mark Osterman, who works for George Eastman House, and his wife, France Scully Osterman, about 25 years ago, began to create a re-interest in this antique process. I soon found out that they would be the people to teach me this process, and I was able to use funding from Austin Peay to visit Rochester 3 times for one-on-one tutorials that helped me learn the technical process and to visit the George Eastman House Museum. I was able to spend a morning in the archives of the museum and was asked ahead of time whose work I was interested in looking at. And I told the archivist, Julie Margaret Cameron and Gustave Legray. And so when I arrived at the archive for my appointed time, on a ledge in the room were these plates and prints made by Julie Margaret Cameron and made by Gustave Legray. And it was just amazing. I was not able to pick up the plate. I was able to pick up the prints with white gloves on, but it was almost as if I was holding gold or something that precious to see their fingerprints on the paper, the evidence of the human connection to the plates and to the prints. Julia Margaret Cameron, she was British, 1860s, and she made portraits of her family, people of that period, Darwin, Tennyson. And oftentimes she was criticized when she would submit her work for exhibition in the large salons that were being held in London at the times. She was often criticized for her lack of perfect technique. Her plates would show mistakes of chemical stains and such that some of mine do. And she responded by saying that was not important to her, that what was important to her was to use the medium to capture the soul of the person, not to capture a perfect, detailed likeness of the person. And I try to talk to my students about that as well. When they take a portrait, that if their intention is simply to capture a detailed likeness of the person, they can find that on their driver's license photo. But for a portrait photographer, trying to go beyond likeness, beyond a description, and capture the essence of a person. I learned that from Julia Margaret Cameron. The chemicals for the collodion that I store down here, one is collodion, this is ether, there's ammonium iodide and cadmium bromide, and so these chemicals that are mixed in to create the collodion, when the plate is coated with the collodion and then immersed into the silver bath, the silver interacts with these chemicals to make the plate light sensitive. The silver bath should be filtered every time after a day of working with it, so that has to be done with safe lights on, and I use the large beakers and place them over here. So that's good. Yeah, the exposure is good. All right. This usually I can recognize as developer problems, but otherwise, not bad. Even though it's the medium that is the most widely used, I mean, today everybody has a camera of some sort, I think it's the history of it is less known. It's amazing. This process is a real mix of science and art. So there's precision required and experimentation. Lots of failures happen and lots of magic happens.
For current and exclusive content, subscribe to CDE Lightband, connecting you at the speed of light.